The demand came to Dellen's in the way it had come for 20 years, over a free meal at the corner table. And this year, for the first time, the paper that slid across the boards toward him had names on it. 2 names. He read them upside down before his hand even reached the paper, because an innkeeper reads everything upside down, that's half the trade. Comb weaver's boy, the Anley girl, both 17. Both born in this town, in beds Dellen could walk to in 5 minutes, in the years when the tribute had already been old business. New terms, said Fitch, and went on eating. Fitch was Cask's quartermaster, and for 20 years he had been the other half of Dellen's worst arrangement. The man who came twice a season with the list, ate his free meal, checked the wagon, and took the tribute of Aldermill back into the hills. Grain, salt pork, tallow, leather, beer. Never money. Cask's company couldn't eat money. For 20 years the list had been goods. Dellen had haggled every line of it, shaved every quantity, buried surplus in false bottom cellars, lied about blights, and paid. Every season paid. And for 20 years no rider of Cask's had burned a barn or opened a throat in Aldermill, while towns 8 miles east that had refused were names people said quietly with a look. We don't trade in people, Dellen said. His voice came out level. 20 years of practice at level. Goods, that's the arrangement. That's been the arrangement since before those 2 could walk. Arrangements are what the captain says they are. Fitch didn't look up from the stew. He looked tired, Dellen thought tired in a new way, a hollow way, and his coat had been mended twice since spring with cord instead of thread. Company's short, bad year in the hills. He wants strong backs and he's taking them from every town on the round, 2 a year 16 to 20 years old delivered with the autumn wagon. That's the term. It isn't mine. And if the wagon comes without them. Fitch stopped eating. He set the spoon down, and for one strange moment, the 2 old enemies who had spent 20 years across this table looked at each other almost like colleagues. The 2 men who between them had kept the worst from happening for 2 decades, both hearing the sound of the arrangement cracking down its middle. Dellen, Fitch said quietly, don't send the wagon short, whatever you're thinking. I've seen what he does now to towns that come up short. He's not the man you built the arrangement with. Hungry captains get worse, not better. Send the wagon whole. He left the paper on the table. Dellen stood a long time looking at 2 names he had watched learn to walk, and then he did the thing he had avoided for 20 years, because it had always been safer for exactly 1 man to carry this weight where the town couldn't argue with it. He called the town together and told them everything. They met in the mill barn, all of Aldermill that could walk, and the argument lasted 4 hours and cut the town down its middle like a saw. Old Marga Prue, who headed the town council, laid it out plain. Pay, and it would be 2 children this year, and 2 next year, and the year Cask was hungrier it would be 4, a tax that grew, as taxes on the helpless always grow, until Aldermill was a farm that raised people for the hills. Refuse, and it would be fire and blood this season, against a company of 40 veteran raiders, in a town whose fighting strength was farmers with boar spears and 1 blacksmith. We pay, said some, and they were not cowards. Dellen knew every face. They were parents of younger children doing the arithmetic of whose names came up in 3 years, and grandmothers who remembered the burned towns east, and men who had seen what 40 riders did to a place and could not unsee it. We refuse, said others, and Comb Weaver stood up among them with his boy's name on the list and his voice shaking, and asked the barn 1 question. Who carries them to the wagon? Show me. Which of you puts my son on it with your own hands? Because it doesn't happen unless somebody here does it. Cask isn't taking him. We would be giving him. And then, because it had to come, because Dellen had known for 20 years that it would come the day the arrangement finally broke, a voice from the back said the other thing. Ask Dellen. Paying's always suited Dellen fine. 20 years he's fed that company with our sweat and shook Fitch's hand over it. Maybe the wagon master likes the arrangement. The barn went quiet. Dellen stood up slowly behind the trestle where the tribute ledger lay, the ledger he had brought on purpose, and found that after 20 years of dreading this exact sentence, hearing it out loud was almost a relief. It suited me fine, he agreed. Here's what suiting me fine has looked like. And he opened the ledger and read it to them, not the quantities, the margins. 20 years of shaved deliveries and buried surplus and invented blights. The season he'd talked Fitch down from a doubled levy by proving, with false books he'd spent a winter forging, that the town would starve. The hollow tally posts by the mill road with 20 years of true accounts hidden in them kept against exactly this night, so that when the town finally judged him, it could judge him on evidence. I've been cheating that company since before some of you were born, not because I'm brave. Because I'm not, that's the whole point of me. Every coward's trick that kept the tribute small enough to survive, I've done it, and I'd have gone on doing it until they buried me and called it a good life's work. He closed the ledger. But I'll tell you what the ledger can't pay. It can't pay 2 names. There's no margin to shave on a person. The arrangement I've kept for 20 years died the day Karsk wrote children on a supply list, and I know it better than any of you, because I'm the one who knows exactly what everything on that list costs. He looked at Combe Weaver. Nobody here carries your boy to a wagon. I vote refuse. The barn voted refuse in the end, not united, never united, but enough. And then the fear started, which is what refusing is, fear, scheduled. So we've decided how we die, said Marga Prue dryly into the after silence. Good, now Dellen, you know that company better than any soul in this barn, what they eat, what they owe, which of them mended his coat with cord this spring, 20 years of ledgers on Karsk's men. The old woman's eyes were bright and hard. So stop voting and start thinking. How does a town of farmers beat 40 riders? Not with spears, with what's in your book. Before he opened a single ledger, Dellen did the thing that made all the ledgers mean something. He went and looked at what the list had asked for. Combe Weaver's boy was called Bren, and Dellen found him splitting wood behind the weaver's shed with the particular violence of a 17-year-old who has heard his own name read out in a barn. The Anley girl, Tilda, was there too, sitting on the woodpile because those two had been inseparable since they could walk, which the whole town knew, and which had made the sight of both their names on one paper feel less like a levy and more like a curse aimed. Come to measure us for the wagon, Bren said, not stopping the axe. 17, and the bitterness already fit him like a coat. Come to tell you what was voted, Dellen said, and to hear you because it's your names, and nobody in that barn asked you, and that was wrong of us. Tilda spoke first. She was the quicker of the two and always had been. We talked about running, she said, flat, watching his face. The night the list came, down to the coast, take ship, be gone before Thursday, we had the bundle packed. Why didn't you? Because he'd just take 2 others, Bren said. The axe came down. That's how it works, isn't it? The list isn't us. The list is 2. We run, and it's the miller's twins or the Petter girl, so we stayed. He set the axe head on the block and looked at Dellen with his father's directness. 17, and the best plan we could make was stand still and be taken so it wasn't somebody else. That's what your 20 years of arrangements grew, wagon master. Kids who do that arithmetic. Dellen stood in the woodyard and took it, because it was owed, and because it was true, and then he gave them the only thing he had. The town voted refuse, he said. Unanimous where it counted. Nobody's being handed over, not you, not the twins, not anyone, not this year or any year. What comes instead is going to be worse before it's better, and I won't lie to either of you about the odds. But hear the arithmetic that Barn did last night, because you got it half right and half wrong. You're right that the list was never really you, it was 2, it was whoever. And that's exactly why it couldn't be paid. A town that will hand over any 2 of its children has already agreed in principle to hand over all of them, one list at a time. We just took 20 years to see it. He turned to go and stopped. Keep the bundle packed, Tilda. If the mill bell rings 3 times, you 2 take the young ones out the fen path, and you don't stop for anything. And that's not the town spending you, that's the town making sure it has a future to be worth the week. That's the last order anyone in Aldermill ever gives you. After this week, you're asked. It wasn't enough. Nothing would have been enough. But walking back, Dellen heard the axe start up again behind him with a different rhythm, work now, not fury, and he wrote that in the account too, where he kept the entries that never touched paper. Dellen spent that night alone with 20 years of tribute records, reading them the way he had never let himself read them before, not as payments, but as intelligence. And by dawn, he understood something that changed the shape of the week. Karsk's company was dying. It was all in the lists, once you read the lists as a body reads a fever chart. 20 years ago the demands had been beer and salt and leather, the wants of a strong company. 5 years ago the beer had vanished from the lists and the grain had doubled. No luxuries, all calories, a company eating to survive. This spring the demand had come early off-season, and it had asked for seed grain. Seed grain. Raiders don't plant. Raiders who ask for seed grain are raiders whose other tribute towns have failed or emptied or been bled dead, a supply network collapsing line by line, exactly like the ledgers of a business going under. And now people, strong backs 16 to 20, not soldiers, cask-head veterans. Labor. A captain trying to make his company grow its own food was a captain whose raiding life was over and who knew it, presiding over hungry men in mended coats. 40 riders, perhaps. 20 years ago it had been 40. Fitch's requisitions, Dellen realized, working the quantities backward through hunger arithmetic, were feeding 30 at most and feeding them badly. "They're not a wolf," Dellen told Margaprue and Combe and the blacksmith hand in the grey of the morning with the ledgers spread across 3 tables. "That's what we've all had wrong 20 years. A wolf you can't argue with, they're a failing house. Hungry men, unpaid in years, following a captain because the company feeds them, one bad month from not being able to, and every man of them has eaten at my table twice a season for 20 years. I know their names. I know which ones were taken from towns like this one when they were 17 on lists like this one." He laid Fitch's paper on top of the ledgers, the 2 names face up. "Almost half that company over the years arrived as tribute. That's the seam. That's where a town of farmers beats 40 riders. You don't beat them. You split them. You offer the hungry half the one thing cask can't, an end. Land, winter, shelter, a place. You can't turn strangers with an offer like that. A stranger reads it as a trap. But I'm not a stranger. I've fed those men, by name, in my own inn for 20 years. "And if they don't split?" Han asked. "If the hungry half is loyal anyway, hungry men love whoever feeds them and cask feeds them." "Then we're dead a week from Thursday instead of Thursday," Dellen said. "I've no better trade to offer, but I'll tell you what 20 years across a table teaches you, Han. It teaches you where a man's loyalty actually sits, and Fitch's doesn't sit with cask. It hasn't for 2 seasons. It sits with the arrangement, with the thing that kept the worst from happening, and cask just killed the arrangement." He stood. "The wagon goes into the hills on Thursday, on schedule, loaded and whole, with me driving it. And we find out what the ledger's worth. Driving the tribute road for the 21st year, alone, with no tribute intention in the load, Dellen discovered that fear has layers, and the deepest one is quiet. The camp in the hills confirmed his ledgers with every detail. Earthworks slumping unrepaired, a horse line short of horses, cook fires burning stingy, and men, he counted 28, and knew most faces with the specific stillness of people conserving strength. Cask received the wagon in the middle of it, and Cask was the worst confirmation of all. A big man gone gaunt inside his own frame, grey-bristled, with the fixed, bright eyes of a captain who has stopped being able to afford doubt. "Where am I to?" Cask said. "Aldermill sent the goods entire," Dellen said from the wagon seat, hands in sight. "Weighed fair, no shaving, first time in 20 years I haven't cheated you, and I'll admit the cheating freely now since we're past it. The people aren't coming, Cask. Not this year, not any year. That's the town's answer. I asked to be the one who carried it." The camp went very still. Cask walked the length of the wagon slowly, trailing one hand along the sideboard, and stopped by the wheel, close enough that Dellen could see what hunger and failure had made of a man he'd feared for 20 years, and it was not less frightening. It was much more. "20 years you've paid," Cask said softly. "Smart town, smart innkeeper, and the 1 year I need more than bacon you find your courage." He smiled with no warmth whatever. "Courage is a spring thing, wagon master. It's autumn. You'll be short 2 young backs and long some graves by the new moon. That's arithmetic, and you're an arithmetic man. Go home. Tell them Thursday's Mercy died in this camp. Tell them what comes now comes from their own vote." "I'll tell them," Dellen said, and then pitched no louder, but pitched. 20 years an innkeeper teaches a man to speak to a whole room while looking at one face. He said the rest. "And I'll tell you all one thing before I turn this wagon, since I've fed most of you by name since you were younger than the boys on that list. Aldermill's winter store is dug in and dry, our fields carried well. There's land unturned along the mill water, and a town short of working hands, and a council that voted last night, the same night it refused you, that any man of this company who comes down out of the hills without a blade in his hand eats at my table that night, and holds a hiring contract by spring. Ask Fitch if my table's word is good. 20 years. Ask him if I ever once served short weight to a man who sat down peaceful. Get him out, Karsk said, in a voice gone dangerous quiet, and Hans took the wagon's bridle, and Dellen drove out of the camp with his shoulder blades waiting the whole mile down for an arrow that did not come. It did not come because Karsk was not a fool. It came instead 3 nights later to the Anley farmstead on the town's east edge, fire in the fodder barn, quick riders in the dark, and old man Anley dead in his yard with a spear through him for coming out to fight the flames. First blood. The grandmother of the girl on Karsk's list buried her son-in-law, and Aldermill learned the price of its vote in the only currency Karsk had left. And Dellen stood in the smoking yard at dawn, with the town looking to him and the weight of the arrangement's death on his shoulders, and said the hardest true thing he'd ever said. He needs us afraid more than he needs us dead. Dead towns pay nothing. Look at his east lists. He's eaten his dead towns already. This is the squeeze. It gets worse before Thursday. Hold. Bury Anley, double the watches, and hold, because every night his men spend burning barns instead of eating supper. My offer sits at their fire with them. Hunger argues for us now. Give it time to talk. The squeeze lasted 4 nights, and Dellen spent them learning what a town under siege actually is, which is a town at war with its own imagination. Riders on the ridgelines at dusk, letting themselves be seen, that was the second night, and it cost nothing and did more damage than the fire had, because a burned barn is a fact and a silhouette is anything you fear. The third night they took the Petter's milk cow from the far pasture and left its head on the tribute road, and half the town read it as tomorrow we come for you, and the other half read it as they're so hungry they're eating our cows one at a time, and both halves were right, and the arguing in the inn that night got ugly enough that Marga Prue had to stand on a bench. Dellen worked the fear like he'd once worked the levies, shaving it, rationing it, keeping the worst of it off the general account. He set the watches in pairs, one steady head with one frightened one, never two frightened together. He kept the inn open late and free, because fear argued louder in dark kitchens than in a lit common room. He put the children's fenpath drill on the second morning where everyone could see it, not hidden, rehearsed, ordinary, until the sight of the young ones filing calmly to the marsh path stopped meaning catastrophe and started meaning we have a plan. And every night, last thing, he walked the wagon line stakes they'd begun quietly driving along the mill road, and looked up at the hills, and thought about hungry men at stingy fires, hearing barns burn, thinking about a hiring contract and a hot table. On the 4th night, the watch caught something at the grain store. 3 of Karsk's men on foot with sacks, not a raid. A theft hungry men sent or come on their own to take what the wagon would have carried, and the watch pair rang the alarm and the town boiled out with torches and boar spears, and for one teetering moment in the yard of the grain store, Aldermill stood a spear length from its first killing, 3 cornered raiders back to back against 40 terrified farmers, everything about to go wrong in the way that can't be taken back. Hold, Dellen got between them with his hands empty, heart slamming, an innkeeper's voice pitched over a crowd for the 10,000th time and never once like this. Hold, look at them, look. And the torchlight steadied and the town looked and saw what Dellen had seen from the door. The sacks were small. 3 men had risked their lives against a roused town for perhaps 2 days of bread. Torven, Dellen said to the oldest of the 3, because he knew him, of course he knew him, 15 years of free meals. The man had a bad knee and a joke he told every autumn about Dellen's beer. Torven, put it down and sit, and I'll fill the sacks proper and you'll carry a message back up with them, or swing that blade and die in a grain yard for 2 days of bread. You know my table, you know which offer's real. Torven looked at the spears, and the sacks, and the innkeeper and sat. They fed all 3 in the lit common room with half the town watching in silence, filled the sacks full, and sent them up the tribute road unharmed, and the message Dellen sent with them wasn't words. It was the sacks themselves, and the memory of a room where the enemy's men ate at tables while the town stood down its own spears to allow it. Fitch came down out of the hills 2 nights later, on foot, without a blade in his hand, and Dellen was never entirely sure the grainyard hadn't been the night that decided it. Fitch came down out of the hills on the 6th night, on foot, without a blade in his hand, and stood in the inn door like 20 years of history deciding where to sit. Did not come alone. Behind him in the dark of the yard stood 11 men, hungry, wary, unarmed by choice and terrified by it, nearly half of what remained of Cask's company, and Dellen looked out over them from his own doorway and recognized, with a strange turning of the heart, face after face after face, men he had served twice a season for 2 decades, and among them, grey now, 4 he could remember arriving in the hills as somebody's tribute, 17 years old on somebody's list. "Is the table's word good?" Fitch said. "It's good," Dellen said. "It was always the only good thing I had. Come in." They ate first. That was Dellen's instinct, and it was the right one, not terms first, not oaths first. Stew first, bread first, the inn warm and lit and ordinary around men who had forgotten ordinary existed. And only after, with the bowls empty, did the talking happen, and the talking was short, because hunger had already made every argument on both sides of it. "He has 16 left," Fitch said. "His oldest, his worst, the ones with nowhere to be men anywhere else. And Dellen, hear me, he's done. He knows it's over, that's what none of you understand about the danger you're in. A captain with a future negotiates. Cask has no future, and a man with no future has no price, and he told the 16 tonight before I walked what tomorrow is. It isn't a raid. Raids are for profit. Tomorrow he burns Aldermill to the ground with everything in it, because if his company dies of a town's vote, then the vote is going to cost more than the paying ever did, and every town on every round for 50 miles is going to hear what refusing Cask bought. He's not coming for tribute, innkeeper. He's coming to write a warning on your ashes." "Then we've one night," Dellen said, and stood, and found the fear had gone somewhere strange and quiet, the way it does when the last version of hope that requires someone else's mercy dies. "One night, 12 turned soldiers, a blacksmith, and a town of farmers who know their own ground. Fitch, you've quartermastered that man for 20 years. You know how he comes at a thing that can't run." "Straight," Fitch said. "Dawn, mounted, torches, straight up the mill road, speed and terror before your farmer's nerve can set. It's the only play he has left, and it's a good one, and it has broken every town it's ever been used on." "The mill road," Dellen said slowly, "and 20 years of wagon driving that exact road, every rut and soft shoulder and the narrow choke where the tally post stood, unrolled in his head like a ledger opening. Then he comes to us up the one lane in this world I know better than he does. Han wake the town, everyone to the mill barn, bring shovels." Cask came at dawn, mounted, torches, straight up the mill road, exactly as his quartermaster had promised, and the mill road was not the road it had been. The town had worked the whole black end of the night with shovel and plough and wagon, and what met the charge at the choke, by the tally posts, was a farmer's battlefield. The roadbed trenched and flooded ankle-deep from the mill race, soft as porridge under the crust of dawn frost. Hay wagons overturned across the narrows, with harrow teeth lashed along their beds. And behind that homely, terrible wall, the town, not scattered in its doorways to be ridden down family by family, but massed, every soul who could hold a boar spear or a scythe or a torch of their own, with Fitch's 12 armored along the wagon line at the points where veterans belonged. The charge hit the flooded ground and died as a charge. Horses foundered in the mud to their hocks, riders pitching. Torches went into the wet road and hissed out, and the speed and terror that had broken every town it was ever used on came apart, floundering, in front of a wall of neighbors who could suddenly see that the monster of 20 years was 16 exhausted men stuck in the mud of a lane. Some of the 16 surrendered right there, hands up in the ruined road, done. Some fought, and it was ugly and short and cost Aldermill. Han the blacksmith took a saber cut that lamed his shoulder for good, and a farmer named Petter died under a horse, defending the wagon line, 40 feet from where he was born. And Cask himself came through it all like the end of something, unhorsed and huge and burning-eyed, cutting his way toward the one figure his whole ruin had narrowed to, the innkeeper, the arithmetic man, the smiling servile ledger-keeper who had cheated him for 20 years, and then taught his own company to leave him. And Dellen, who was not a fighter and had never once pretended to be, stood his ground behind the wagon line because his legs would not run in front of his town, and was saved the way he had lived, by the arrangement. Fitch stepped into the gap and killed his captain of 20 years with one clean stroke, and stood over him in the muddy road, breathing hard, and said to the body, to the town, to 20 years, "You changed the terms." They buried Petter and old Anley in the town ground with full rights, and Karsk and his dead in the hill ground with quiet ones, because Marga Prue said, and no one argued, that how a town buries its enemies is a thing the town has to live with longer than the enemies do. The surrendered went to the conquered's justice at the coast, escorted alive. The 11 who had walked down without blades, 12 with Fitch, wintered in Aldermill under the table's word, and by spring the unturned land along the mill water was turned, and the town that had been short of working hands was not, and if there were farmhouses where old neighbours never quite stopped watching new ones, well, Marga Prue said that two was a thing you lived with, and living with things was what a town was. Dellen kept the inn. He also kept, because the council voted it before he could refuse, the ledger promoted now from tribute book to town book, births and harvests and hirings where the levies used to go. On the first quiet evening, he sat with it alone and ruled off the tribute pages for the last time, and found he owed the account one honest closing entry, and sat a long while over what 20 years came down to. He had spent those years certain of the shape of his own story, the coward's ledger, the shameful peace, the man who shook the quartermaster's hand twice a season so that braver towns could call him tame. And the vote had not changed that man into a hero. Dellen had checked carefully the way he checked all figures. He had been afraid every hour of that week, and he had driven the wagon into the hills afraid and stood behind the wagon line afraid. No. What the week had changed was the arithmetic of the 20 years themselves. Every shaved delivery had kept the town strong enough to survive refusing. Every free meal served to a hungry raider had been, without his knowing it, a deposit in the only account that mattered in the end, the account that let 12 men believe a town's word over a warlord's, because the innkeeper had never once served them short weight. The compromise hadn't been the opposite of the resistance. It had been the resistance, banking itself, 20 years deep, waiting for the one demand that could never be paid. You couldn't have told him that at the time. That was the part he'd never be able to explain to the young ones. At the time it just felt like shame, every season, twice a season, for 20 years. The ledger only balances backward. He dipped the pen and wrote the closing line, and it was short, because the truth usually is. Tribute account closed, paid in full grain, 20 years and 2 names refused. The town stands. D. Then he turned the page to the new accounts, the births and the harvests and the hirings, and got on with the only arrangement he had ever actually wanted to keep, which was Aldermill continuing.